The church was a vision of white and gold, glowing with the promise of a perfect day. The soft hum of the guests filled the air, a low murmur of anticipation. My heart raced as I clutched Ben's arm, his grip steady and comforting. He had been my rock, my unwavering support through every storm. Today, he would walk me down the aisle to Simon, the love of my life. As we stood at the church entrance, the music swelled, filling the space with a melody that seemed to lift me off the ground. This was it, the moment I had dreamed of since I was a little girl. I took a deep breath, ready to step into my future. But then, with a thunderous crash, the church doors behind us slammed open. I froze. The sound echoed through the church, cutting through the soft music like a knife. Slowly, I turned, dread pooling in my stomach. Julia. The voice, sharp and familiar, sent a chill down my spine. Evelyn. My mother. A figure from my past that I had long since buried. She marched down the aisle, her heels striking the marble floor like the tolling of a bell. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Ben's grip tightened on my arm, his jaw clenched in anger. Evelyn, this isn't the time, he hissed, his voice low and fierce. But Evelyn ignored him, her eyes locked onto mine with a predatory gleam. Julia, darling, she cooed, her smile razor sharp. There's no wedding without your mother here, is there? I felt the color drain from my face, my pulse pounding in my ears. Mom, what are you doing here? I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. She stopped in front of me, her smirk growing. I couldn't miss my daughter's big day, could I? But before you walk down that aisle, there's something you need to know. I glanced at Ben, his face ashen, silently pleading with her to stop. But Evelyn was never one to let an opportunity for drama pass her by. Ben isn't your real father, Julia, she declared, her voice ringing through the church, ensuring everyone heard. He never was. You were the result of an affair. The world tilted, the ground beneath me feeling as unstable as my racing thoughts. I could hear the whispers spreading like wildfire, feel the burning gaze of the congregation on me. My knees buckled, and I turned to Ben, tears blurring my vision. Is it true? I whispered, my voice breaking. His silence, the pain in his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. My perfect world, the one built on years of love and trust, crumbled in that moment. Without a word, I ran. The church blurred around me, tears streaming down my face as I fled. I could hear Simon's voice calling after me, the weight of 1,000 eyes following my every step, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I needed to escape, to breathe, to think. I burst through the side doors of the church into the garden, the cool air slapping against my tear-streaked cheeks. I collapsed onto a bench, burying my face in my hands as sobs racked my body. The day that was supposed to be the happiest of my life had turned into a nightmare. A few moments later, I heard footsteps approaching. I knew it was Ben without looking up. He sat beside me in silence, letting me cry until the tears slowed. I'm sorry, Julia, he finally said, his voice thick with regret. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. I didn't want to lose you. I looked up at him, my heart breaking all over again. How could you keep this from me? How could you let me live a lie? Ben's face crumpled, and he reached for my hand. Because you are my daughter, Julia. I raised you, loved you. Nothing Evelyn says can change that. His words were full of love, but they couldn't ease the storm raging inside me. I needed answers. But more than that, I needed time. I can't do this right now, I whispered. The wedding. Everything. I need time. Ben nodded, understanding and pain etched into his features. We'll postpone the wedding, he said gently. Simon will understand. We'll figure this out together. With a heavy heart, I wiped away my tears and stood up. Let's tell Simon, I said, my voice steady. The wedding can wait. As we walked back into the church, hand in hand, I knew nothing would ever be the same. But I also knew that I wasn't alone. Ben had been my father in every way that mattered, and no revelation could take that away from us. But one thing was clear, I needed to find my biological father. I needed to know the truth. The days after the wedding that wasn't passed in a blur, each one blending into the next. My emotions were a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and confusion, with no clear direction. The only constant was Ben, who stayed by my side through it all. Simon, too, was incredibly supportive, patient, and understanding, giving me the space I needed to figure out who I was before we could move forward together. But the more I tried to move on, the more I realized that I couldn't, not until I found my biological father. The questions gnawed at me, relentless and unyielding. Who was he? Why had he never been a part of my life? Did he even know I existed? These thoughts consumed me until I couldn't ignore them any longer. Ben and I decided to take a DNA test, not because I doubted his love, but because I needed confirmation, a final truth to cling to in the chaos. When the results came back, confirming that we weren't biologically related, it was like a knife to the heart. Yet, strangely, it also brought a sense of closure. The uncertainty was gone, and now, I could focus on finding the man responsible for my existence. There was only one person who could help me, Evelyn. The thought of confronting her again filled me with dread, but I knew I had no choice. She was the keeper of the truth I desperately needed. I arranged to meet her at a dingy cafe on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the elegant venue she once frequented. The place reeked of stale coffee and broken dreams, a fitting backdrop for the woman who had abandoned me. When I walked in, I found her sitting at a corner table, nursing a glass of wine, even though it was barely noon. Her eyes met mine as I approached, and a faint smirk curled her lips. Well, if it isn't my long-lost daughter," she drawled, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "What brings you to my humble abode?" I sat down across from her, my stomach churning with a mix of nerves and disgust. "I need to know who my biological father is," I said, cutting straight to the point. There was no time for games. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by my directness. "Why now, after all these years? What difference does it make?" "It makes a difference to me," I replied, my voice trembling but resolute. "I have a right to know where I come from." She took a long sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving mine. "It was a long time ago, Julia. I can barely remember his name." I wasn't buying her act. I knew Evelyn too well to believe she'd forgotten something so significant. "Please, Mom," I pleaded, hating how desperate I sounded. "I need to know." Evelyn set her glass down and leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Fine," she said after a long pause. "But it's going to cost you." Of course, it would. Everything with Evelyn had a price tag. "How much?" I asked, bracing myself for the inevitable blow. She named a figure that made my heart sink. It was more than I could afford, but I didn't have any other options. Reluctantly, I agreed to her terms, handing over the last of my savings. Evelyn took the money with a satisfied smile and scribbled something on a piece of paper. "Here," she said, sliding it across the table. "This is where you'll find him." I took the paper, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. It felt surreal, like I was holding a piece of my identity that had been missing for so long. "Thank you," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow. Gratitude was the last thing I felt. As I stood to leave, Evelyn called after me, her voice laced with mockery. "Good luck, Julia. You're going to need it." I didn't respond. I walked out of the cafe, clutching the piece of paper tightly, determined to find the man who had unknowingly shaped my life. The address led me to a grand mansion on the edge of town, its towering gates and manicured lawns a stark contrast to the modest life I had known with Ben. The house loomed before me, intimidating in its opulence. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was making a mistake, but then I thought of all the unanswered questions that had haunted me and forced myself to move forward. I rang the doorbell, my heart hammering in my chest. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing a man in his late 50s. His appearance screamed wealth, designer clothes, neatly combed blonde hair, sharp blue eyes that seemed to assess me in an instant. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to begin. "My name is Julia," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I think you might be my father." His eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, we simply stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. He stepped forward, reaching out to take my hand. "This is incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've dreamed of having a daughter my whole life." Meeting Philip was like stepping into another world. He was everything I had never known, successful, confident, and overflowing with pride at discovering he had a daughter. He showed me around his mansion, introducing me to a life of luxury that felt foreign and almost suffocating. He offered to walk me down the aisle when I eventually rescheduled the wedding. His gesture was kind, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine the grandeur of it all. But then, guilt crept in, an unwelcome shadow. How could I replace Ben, who had been there for every scraped knee, every school event, every heartbreak? The days passed in a haze as I struggled to reconcile my old life with this new reality. I spent time with Philip, learning about his world and trying to understand who he was. But with each visit, the sense of unease grew. It felt like I was betraying the man who had always been my father in every way that mattered. The night before the rescheduled wedding, I found myself sitting in my old bedroom at Ben's house, staring at the two dresses hanging on the door. One was for the ceremony, and the other for the reception, a reminder that tomorrow was supposed to be a day of celebration. But all I felt was dread. Ben knocked softly before stepping inside. "Hey, kiddo," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Nervous about tomorrow?" I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Yeah, a little." He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Julia, whatever you decide, I'll be proud of you. Whether I walk you down the aisle or not, nothing changes how much I love you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I finally looked at him. "You've always been my dad, Ben. I just don't know how to choose." He smiled, though sadness tinged his expression. "You don't have to choose. We'll figure it out together." The next day, the church was once again filled with friends and family, their excitement palpable. But I could barely hear it over the pounding of my heart. As I stood in the bride's room, staring at my reflection, the door creaked open. Evelyn walked in, a glass of wine in hand, as if she were the guest of honor. "Thank you for inviting me this time," she said, her tone mocking. "I invited you so you wouldn't ruin this day again," I replied coldly. "Please don't cause a scene." She smiled, that same smile I had come to dread. "Oh, don't worry, dear. But let's be real, 2 fathers? That's ridiculous. Choose the one with more money. He can give you everything you want, and you can give some to me." I stared at her, disgust swirling in my chest. "You're a horrible person. You got rid of me once, remember? Why should I listen to you now?" Before she could respond, the wedding planner knocked on the door. "Have you decided who will walk you down the aisle, Julia?" I took a deep breath, calming the storm of thoughts in my head. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I have." Minutes later, as the music swelled, I stepped into the aisle with both Philip and Ben by my side. The weight of the decision lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. I didn't need to choose between them. They were both my fathers, in different ways. "I don't have a mother," I whispered to them as we walked, "but I'm grateful to have 2 fathers." Evelyn, watching from the back, looked outraged. I met her gaze and spoke the words that would close this chapter of my life for good. I removed the one who causes problems. As the ceremony continued, I knew my decision had been the right one. Later, after the vows and the celebration, Simon, Ben, Philip, and I filed a restraining order against Evelyn, cutting her out of our lives for good. In the months that followed, Philip and Ben developed a bond, united by their love for me and my new family. They became the grandfathers my children adored, and we spent our days in peace and happiness, cherishing the family we had built together. I had found my place in the world, surrounded by the people who truly mattered. And as the years passed, I never once regretted my decision to embrace both of my fathers. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.